Everybody, thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I'm going to try and turn on my camera now, and hopefully you'll be able to see me as well as hear me, and you should be able to see some slides in front of you. My name is Andy Chamberlain. I am the Director of Policy at IPSE, and I'm joined today by my colleague Ryan. Ryan, are you there?
Yep, hopefully my camera's working.
Yeah, it looks like it's about to appear. So you should be able to see both Ryan and I, and see the slides and hear us. And it would be very reassuring if you could just put in the questions box that you can see and hear us okay. Although I have to say I can't see Ryan at the moment. I can just see a black box where Ryan's face should be. Well, maybe we'll continue anyway. So if you can't see Ryan, trust me, you better. No, I don't mean that. If you can't see Ryan, don't worry. I don't think anyone can at the moment. So we'll try and resolve that as we go along. But we can hear Ryan okay. We're going to be talking about COVID-19, the economy, the impact it's had on the economy, how that's impacting freelancers, and then having a bit of a look ahead to the second wave. Now, a few months ago, or a couple of months ago, we were doing some pretty regular COVID-19 webinars because there was so much new things going on. We thought we'd do an update on that stuff. What are the schemes that are available? What's the status of those schemes now? When are they being wound up? And then also to think a little bit about what's going to happen if there is a second wave of this terrible pandemic. What does that mean for these schemes, and the fact that the government seems very much intent on winding them up at the moment. So Ryan, if you could just flick on to the next slide.
Yeah, apologies. You can't see my face, but I can assure you I have a lovely post-COVID lockdown haircut, unlike Andy.
And we're both very more bearded than me. So as I say, we're going to look at how effective some of those policies have been, where they've fallen down, and then look at what might happen to them in the future. And we will answer your questions. So please do send us your questions. We will try to leave time at the end to do the questions. You'll also get a feedback form probably after watching this webinar, along with some links that are contained in here that you might find useful. And we know from previous feedback that people like it when we leave time for questions. And we always try. So I always talk too much and then we don't have enough time for questions, but I'm trying my very best to address that so we do have plenty of time for questions as we go through. So I'm going to hand over to Ryan now, who's going to talk us through what's going on economically as a result of the coronavirus.
So actually, there's been some information out today. Apologies, there we go, a bit of a technical issue, number 2. And the Bank of England have released some updated information, which I'll talk about now. There's a lot going on, obviously, worldwide. There is a lot of negative stories here in the UK related to the high street. The big picture really is that most developed countries and developing countries are seeing a hit to their GDP of around 8%, sometimes much higher, but that's pretty much the ballpark figure. And right at the start of the process, and we spoke about this a couple of months ago, the predictions were pretty bad, but they were more short-term. People were expecting a V-shaped recovery, so a really big hit initially, and then a fast recovery as, say, COVID passed, the lockdown ended, etc. So Bank of England were predicting a drop in GDP of something like 14%, and this was going to be the biggest recession in the history of capitalism since 1706, which is when something called the Great Frost happened, and literally the economy was frozen to a standstill. Nothing grew, and the economy of most countries based on agriculture and everything fell apart. They've updated their predictions, as have central banks around the world. And most people think that actually what's going to happen now is more like a sort of L-shaped kind of recovery, where the initial hit hasn't been quite as bad, but things will take a long time to get back up and running. And a lot of that is to do with behavioural stuff, because even if the pubs are open, even if people are spending money on the high street, people are still reluctant to go out there. And also there's been a big hit to employment, as you can see on the slide. Just between March and June, 650,000 people less less payroll. That doesn't cover everyone. And we've heard pretty much daily for the last weeks, the furlough scheme starts to unwind, which we'll cover a little bit later, that a lot of the high street shops, a lot of particularly food outlets that are built around stations or big employment areas in central London or even airports are really, really suffering. And you can see, obviously, the travel companies have been hit really hard. The trains in this country have effectively been nationalised, and it's not just us, it's quite similar looking across Europe. The same behavioural effects on the economy are having the same effects on the firms that are doing well or badly out of it. And if you look at the US, which is widely reported to have quite a mixed response economically and health-wise to COVID, they're expecting still unemployment figures, probably by the time of the November presidential election, to possibly be even higher than it was during the Great Depression, which I think was about getting on for sort of 10% of the workforce. And but now that you're talking about 30 million people or something out of work. So in the UK, particularly in terms of freelancing, we've seen a drop year on year of 105,000 freelancers. So it's June to June. That's a huge drop, especially when you consider last year that we reached over 5 million self-employed and freelancers in the UK, a record figure. But I think, Andy, you were saying the drop actually seasonally.
Yeah, the drop since the last quarter is actually 178,000. 168. It's even more significant. Now, we don't normally compare quarter to quarter because you do get seasonal shifts that happen, so it's always more useful to look at what it was last year. But it is a noticeable drop, that, and of course that quarter has been the COVID quarter, hasn't it? So definitely self-employed businesses have been impacted by COVID to the point that they've closed. People aren't saying they're self-employed anymore. I was talking to someone at the BBC about this, and I think that there's a lot of churn within self-employment all the time. So there's a population of people who are self-employed now that weren't self-employed last year, and vice versa. And I think what I would imagine is the case is that there's very few new people coming in self-employment in the last quarter. It would normally have been. No one's thinking, oh, now's a good time to start my self-employed business, basically. So there's that too. Maybe these are the factors why we've seen this dramatic drop.
Well, and actually on those numbers as well, when the ONS put their figures together, people have to sort of self-select that they work for themselves, and there's different options available. And we know from our own research and the research of others that there's a lot of different groups out there that aren't being picked up in the stats. If you're part-time self-employed or a newer self-employed person, you might not necessarily be picked up by the overall statistics. And we've seen the FDI, our quarterly survey into the economy and self-employment and the sentiment of freelancers around the economy and business decisions, comes out next week, and we have up-to-date data that's not quite fully finished, but we've seen a really big hit to incomes. I can't tell you the exact figure yet, but it's the biggest on record. However, there are some good signs out there because confidence has started to return. So perhaps the hit has been medium term. We won't know, and this goes for the GDP stuff as well, we won't know just how bad this is probably until the end of the year in terms of the long-term impact it has on the number of freelancers. But we're starting to get a much better idea now as some of this data comes through. And next week, actually, we'll have up-to-date figures on the amount of people that have come into self-employment and the amount of people in self-employment in different industries. And that will cover the sort of March to June kind of period, which is obviously peak COVID lockdown and the economic hit. So we'll have a bit more of an idea exactly how bad it could potentially be then.
So without wanting,
of course,
I know, Ryan, that you're going to save up some of that stuff for when those figures are properly released. But it's interesting to me that what that seems to be saying is there has been a dramatic fall in income, but that people are sensing that things are picking up. And maybe that's the income relates to the period where lockdown was in full effect. And now as they look forward to the more lockdown eased section of this pandemic, they're thinking things are going to get better and we're going to start earning again. but they don't know that. That's just their confidence. That's just what they feel is going to happen. Is that? Do you feel? Is that the story? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite complicated in terms of. So our confidence figures look medium term, 3 months, and across the year, and they're quite negative about the year, but they're not as negative as they were. And the figures we had for their economic and business confidence in the last survey were like by far the worst on record, way worse than anything we saw around Brexit. And
which we thought
I think
terrible. We thought
it was like -80%.
We thought Brexit was a disaster. Now it seems like it was a doddle compared to.
Oh yeah, and also it was like with Brexit, it was sort of there was a couple of really bad moments last year around like when no deal looked quite likely, but this is the sharpest fall. It was just straight down. It was almost a straight line down. But it's not just, there's a couple of things in there. One, in terms of how confident you are about something, that's all based on information you have as an economic actor. And so if you have more information, you can be more or less confident about something. But when we took those results in March, that was the same week the furlough scheme was announced, and everyone was like quite concerned about if there's going to be anything for the self-employed. Also about the general economy. There were stories about the worst recession in 300 years coming out. Now people have more information, they can make a more sort of nuanced guess about how they feel about the rest of the year economically. Also at that time, IR35 was still coming out. It hadn't actually quite been delayed yet. So there's that to factor in as well. And I think with the income, I'm not going to say how bad it is because, you know, we're going to release those figures next week, but they are quite stark. There is reason to believe that the hit to income might sort of become a new normal. I know this phrase is used a lot at the moment, but freelancers have been traditionally earning a lot more than their counterparts in employment because they offer specific skills, and you know there's lots of different reasons for that. But perhaps they'll lock into something, and hopefully the income won't slip another, you know, big percentage. But we'll tell you a lot more about that next week. But it is still pretty stark. I mean, you know, earnings have been hit, and depending on how the rest of the year goes, there might be some knock-on effects. But we can explore those as they sort of come. And there are other implications to this, and actually a big reason why perhaps some of these numbers are harder to identify, but also another reason that they're being driven is the public policy response, which I'll come to now. We know, so the SAYS, the job rotation schemes rolled out in March, but we know there's 2 to 3 million people potentially excluded in lots of different camps. You know, limited company directors are, you know, there's at least 715,000 of them who haven't had any chance of getting real government support, apart from maybe being able to furlough themselves for a little bit of PAYE.
Ryan,
can
I just clarify that the SAYS stands for Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. This is the scheme which helps. We're going to talk much more about the parameters of the scheme a bit later in the webinar, but just in case anyone was confused, we use it. I'm always conscious that we use acronyms because we're used to it, but not everyone's aware of what they mean. Sorry, Ryan, go on.
Good shout. Apologies. So yeah, the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, it misses a lot of different people, and it's not eligible. You're not eligible if there's 50k cap and all sorts of stuff, which we'll go over in a minute. Now, the big problem here that got rolled out, and if you're involved in the scheme, that's great. You know, it was for those inside the tent, it was very generous, but there was a lot of people left out. It's also paid in grants at the end of a 3-month period, and the big problem for us and anyone that's involved and has support from this scheme is that even though people that are self-employed aren't affected any differently to those that are employed, there is a disparity between when the SAYS ends, paid in a grant form in August, and people that can get a furlough payment, and that's in a month by month like wage replication device, and that ends in October. That's 3 months. Now, surely the disparity there is just purely unfair, and we might see a big impact on those numbers I mentioned earlier when that sort of thing. When the SAYS starts to when it ends, because it doesn't unwind, it's a flat stop. And when the furlough scheme does unwind, but much slower, that will start to have an impact on those figures around employment, but also there's an amount of self-employment out there in the UK. So,
picking up on these schemes, one of the problems with them has been that they haven't helped everyone. Those groups, there are several sort of well-known groups now, and fairly well sort of identifiable groups that were excluded from either the job retention scheme or the SAYS scheme. They are company directors, which many of you watching this will be, because many IPSE members work by their own limited company. They can't make use of the SAYS scheme, the self-employed income support scheme. It's only for sole traders. And they can make use of the job retention scheme, but it's really awkward. It only pays you on the salary element of what you were paying yourself before. It doesn't take account of dividends. And also, the idea of furloughing yourself when you're the only person inside the company means it's very hard to see how the company can continue to do that while you're furloughed. So although technically you can do it, it's not as helpful as it could be. And we wrote to the Chancellor and indeed submitted evidence to the Treasury Select Committee about a solution for the dividend issue. The government said that, well, we can't account for dividends because we don't know whether those dividends have come from someone's own company or from investment portfolios. And we said, well, there is a way. We called it pay now, claw back later. And the Treasury Select Committee really liked it. They specifically said, IPSE, they said to the government, IPSE has told you what to do here, you should implement that. And the government, which responded to that inquiry report about 2 weeks ago, said, look, we have looked very long and hard at the IPSE proposal, but we're just not satisfied that we can do this without what they call a manual check. They just want everything to be easy and automated. So our view on that is that we are disappointed that the government's taken that line, and the feeling is that we have, and we're trying to be as nice as we possibly can, because these schemes were difficult to create and set up, but we do feel that since they've been set up, the hard work was then done, and there was an opportunity to look at how we can plug some of these gaps, and that the government has perhaps been a little reluctant to explore every avenue. Would be our feeling about that. Now, on top of that, you've got other groups that have missed out too, such as newly self-employed sole traders. If you've only been trading since April 2019, you can't make use of the SAYS because you had to do a tax return for the 18-19 tax year. Now, our solution to that was pretty easy. We've now ended the 19-20 tax year, the 2019-2020 tax year, and so people could do a tax return now, get that in, and make use of the SAYS scheme. But the government say they're worried about fraud. They mean serious organised crime fraud on that one. Again, difficult to argue. It's hard for IPSE or anyone else to say, well, there is no fraud threat. If the government says there's a fraud threat, there's a fraud threat. That's a bit of a tongue twister. But we do again feel that perhaps something could have been done there. Some measures put in place to limit the risk from the fraud and still get the money to people that need them. So it's a bit more of this general sort of sense of, we've done what we've done, say the government, and we're not doing it, we've drawn a line under it. Now, the Resolution Foundation did a report recently, which we fed into, where they reimagined how these schemes could be actually put back into place, particularly if there was to be a second wave, and thinking about how these excluded groups could be brought into the schemes. And we very much support what they were saying in there, but still nothing from the government in terms of looks like they're going to change. And the kind of big question is, if we have more, if we have another national lockdown, or if we have more local lockdowns, and those schemes have ended, then what's going to happen to people who can't work, can't get income at that time? And will the government have to come up with some new schemes or dust off these old ones and bring them back in some way? That's, I think, the next area for policy, because most people seem to believe, and I'm no epidemiologist, so I'm only going to go on what I'm being told, but I'm being told it by some pretty senior people in the government, that there is likely to be a second wave, and that will therefore require some sort of policy response. Will the government simply say, oh, it's a second wave, you've got to lock down either nationally or regionally, but we're not going to give you any support while that's happening? That seems to be inconsistent with what they've done before. So I think that there is likely to be a new set of discussions around what support could be made available in the second wave, and could we learn some lessons from the first wave? And that's why I think that a lot of the campaigning that IPSE has been doing, as well as some other groups that we've had on this webinar, such as Excluded UK, such as Forgotten Limited, the conversations we've had with Sir Ed Davey on this webinar, and indeed with the Small Business Minister Paul Scully, I think that we can, all that work could be important in the instance of there being a second wave. And the other thing, of course, that the government is seemingly really looking to rely on is test and trace. So my opinion, I haven't been told this by anyone, is that the government is very reluctant to enter another national lockdown, and they are looking for another solution to bringing down the R rate. And I think that test and trace is what that's where they want it to be, and they're trying to make that work. And I think that it's probably not working at full capacity at the moment. I think we could safely say that. We know that there's been problems with this app. About 6 weeks ago, we were all hearing that we were all going to have an app within weeks. But I think there's been problems with that, but they're still working on it. They do want to push this out. It's going to be all about giving much more regional advice and much more individual risk-based advice as well. So I was on a business call with Baroness Dido Hardy, who is in charge of the UK's test and trace strategy. And she was talking about how the advice that's been given before, which is, well, if you're over 70, you have to shield and stay indoors no matter what, is not necessarily particularly good advice, because some people who are over 70 might be quite fit, and they may also not come into too much contact with people anyway as part of their day-to-day life. Whereas if you are a taxi driver who's in Blackburn, Lancashire, who's in his 50s, and you're a man, because men are being health-wise being more impacted than women, it seems, by this virus, and if you're from an ethnic minority, because there also seems to be some suggestions that there's a link there, then they really want to talk to you, and they will give you advice which might be different and suggest that you shield further than someone who's over 70. Anyway, so this is where they're trying to go with it. But the thing that I think is the big question mark for self-employed people in particular is, if this test and trace system gets up and running, it means that someone might contact you and say, or the app might contact you and say, you've been in contact with someone who's tested positive for coronavirus, and you now need to enter 14 days of quarantine. But the SAYS has gone, you need the income, you're desperate for the income to come in, and your work involves you leaving the house. So what are they going to do to help support people who have had that imposed upon them? They could go down a very sort of military enforcement route, threaten you with sanctions, penalties, prison time, fines, whatever it might be, if you don't adhere to the quarantine rules. But they could also help you out if you're saying, I've got to feed my family, and the only way I can get any money is to go out and do some work. So, that puts me in a really difficult situation. I think that that's another big area for a lot of policy thinking to do. And I did raise that question, that specific question, with Dido Hardy as well when I spoke. Yeah, go ahead.
Of course, actually on the test and trace, there's a lot of local authorities aren't happy with it. And I think Blackburn's one of them. There's a couple of others that have set up their own test and trace system. So I reckon that I saw it on Newsnight that the national scheme just is too inflexible, it's too centralised. But the question, I think, Andy, really is that there's universal credit and there's sick pay, right? There's sick pay for employees. And you could access universal credit in that situation, but if it's like September, so these SAYS is ended, it's September, and a similar employee can still access the furlough scheme and doesn't have to necessarily go down the universal credit route, because by the time it gets to September, the amount of money you get paid in the furlough scheme is basically equivalent to what you get in universal credit anyway. But it's a lot quicker. Universal credit takes 5 weeks. You have to quarantine for 2 weeks, and it's immediate. You're self-employed, you haven't got that option. So you have to literally choose between going out to work and infecting everyone, and potentially putting your health and your family's health at risk, and everyone else as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that why I am particularly concerned about, and I use the term self-employed in the broader sense, people who work for themselves, people who don't have the protections of an employer, is because I think that many employers will be quite responsible and we'll say, look, you've been told you've got to stay at home, so stay at home and don't worry, we're just going to keep paying you anyway. It's as if you're going on 2 weeks of sick leave, basically. We're just going to pay you. Self-employed people don't have that. Whether they're a contractor working by their own limited company or whether they're a sole trader or whatever they are, they don't have that. And that's the area that I think the government's going to have to think very carefully about. And bear in mind, this is 15% of the labour market we're talking about. It's not a tiny group of people. This is a significant number of people. So we at IPSE are going to be discussing exactly this sort of thing, and we are already raising it at the highest levels of government. What's on the next slide, Ryan? Move us on a bit.
Available support.
Yeah, so that's our sort of look at the future and what we think the areas are that are likely to impact self-employed people. What we're going to do quickly now is run over the areas where this is more the practical advice. So this is what's going on right now. This is what you can do, and we're going to start with the self-employed income support, or SAYS scheme as we call it. Now, in order to qualify or be eligible for this scheme, first of all, you have to be a sole trader. You can't work for your own limited company. So your limited companies are not part of this scheme, which we think possibly they should be, or they should be able to make better use of the job retention scheme, or they should have their own scheme, but they don't, which is a problem, as I've already discussed. In order to make use of this, you have to have done a tax return for the 18-19 tax year. If you've done the previous 2 tax years as well, they'll all be taken into account. And what happens is the government look at how much you've earned in those tax years, and they will work out a payment to you based on what you earned in those relevant tax years. If you started after April 2019, as I said before, you haven't done the right tax return, so you're not in, you're excluded. We don't think that should be the case either, and people could do a tax return, as I said earlier, but they are. If you earn over £50,000 in profits during the relevant tax years that you filed for, then you are excluded. That's another big problem with the SAYS scheme. There is no taper. It would have been quite easy to put in a taper, I think. We could have simply said, look, if you earn over the 50, if you earn between 50 and 60,000 pounds, rather than the 80% that you initially got, we'll give you 70% and taper it down like that. But no, you're just out. Your income has to be at least 50% from self-employment. So if you earn 49% of your income from self-employment and the other 51% from, say, unemployment, then you're out. Or if you got it from investments or whatever else it might be, you're out. So again, these are the sharp edges that this scheme had. You know, it's actually a pretty generous scheme. There's never been anything like it before. The word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot in this day and age, but there has never been anything like this scheme before. And it was set up pretty quickly, and hats off to HMRC for making it work and actually getting payments out the door to people ahead of when they said they would do. But it's got really sharp edges, and if you fall outside of it, you're just outside of it. There's no kind of halfway house with this scheme. So that's one of the limitations of it. However, if all of that applies to you, then you can make use of it. Ryan, could you move on to the next slide, please? I keep on trying to do it myself because normally I control the slides, but we had some problems with my internet earlier, so we decided Ryan would do it, and then his camera didn't
now
work.
you can't see me.
Being a bit let down with technology today. Now, the initial SAYS scheme was to cover the months of March, April, and May, and as we came towards the end of May, we didn't know that the government were going to do anything after that. It really was right up towards the end of that first SAYS scheme before the Chancellor announced what we were asking him to do, which was to say that he would extend the SAYS scheme. And what he said is there will be a second SAYS grant. And he said this will be the final grant. He was absolutely certain about this. He really did seem to want to draw a line under this and say there won't be any more after this. This is your lot. Now, we've already talked about how that may be problematic, because if we see a second wave, we're not sure how that will work. But that's what he's saying at the moment. That's what he has said. So at the moment, this is it for now. Now, applications for this claim can be done from the 17th of August. With SAYS 1, I sat with a couple of people and went through the claims process, and it was very, very simple. Couple of questions. You had to have your unique taxpayer reference number and your national insurance number, know what your name is and probably your date of birth. And then it just came up and it said, right, we've already got this information about you. We can see that you earned this much. So we've calculated it and this is what you're going to get. And that's it. And you just say, yeah, I understand the terms and conditions or whatever it might be. And you got the money. You got the money within about 3 or 4. They said 6 working days, but in my experience, it was more like 3 or 4 working days. The people that I knew that claimed this, so people got their money pretty swiftly, and it was a 5-minute process, very, very easy, probably less than 5 minutes, very, very easy to do. Now the second stage grant is going to be slightly different to the first. This one you're going to get 70% of those historical trading profits. In the first one, it was 80%, and the maximum grant that you can get now is going to be 6,570. That's for 1 quarter of the year, basically. So if you've earned the correct amount of money, but not over £50,000 in the years prior, on average, then you will. But you're close to that limit. What you'll get is £6,570, and you can claim that from the 17th of August. But there's a quote there that Ryan said would be a good idea to highlight, and I agree that what they're saying, they did begin to mention this with the first grant as well, but it came in latterly even within that process. But what the question is, you must confirm to HMRC that your business has been adversely affected, and now they want it's got to be affected since the 14th of July 2020. Then you can make a claim. So if you think, oh, my business hasn't been affected, then that technically means you're not entitled to the SAGE grant. But I think that this is a very problematic area because it's so open to interpretation. If you've received less money in this period because of the coronavirus, then you can say, I've been affected. I would normally, I'll have earned X amount during this period, but I haven't because of the coronavirus, so I've been impacted. But you could equally say, well, actually, I've earned pretty much just what I did last year and what I was expecting to earn this year. However, I did have an expectation that I was going to get some new contract in, and that didn't happen because of the coronavirus. So I've been adversely impacted. So this is where I think it does get a little bit difficult. I saw Martin Lewis, the money saving expert, who has been a very good source of information for lots of people, and particularly company directors. Actually, he's been doing some campaigning for them as well. And I saw him saying, well, you know, if you've been adversely affected, so it's up to you. I sort of feel like, well, maybe that is true, but I still think there's potential for grey area there. And my concern is that HMRC might come back to a few people and say, we don't think that you were adversely affected. And then the onus is on you to prove that you were. Could get a bit ugly. There's no suggestion that that's going to happen, but they are hammering home this point that you must have been adversely affected to receive the grant. Because in the initial concept of all of this, it was going to be the case that even if you were happily working away from home and weren't financially impacted at all, you still got the grant. It didn't make any difference. They're trying to put this caveat in to prevent those people from claiming, but I don't know whether they're going to look back to enforce that or not. Maybe they will, I don't know. Something interesting to just be mindful of if you are planning on claiming the SAGE grant. Could we move on to the next slide, please, Ryan?
Well, it's me now, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and rattle through these last bits a little bit quickly, because luckily we've got quite a good amount of time for questions. We don't always, we're trying our best to make sure there's a good amount of time at the end of these to have time for questions, but sometimes we can be a little bit susceptible to chattering a bit too long, Andy. So if you've got some questions that you haven't had answered yet, or is there anything on your mind, do drop them in and we'll hopefully have time to answer them. So yeah, the SAYS, if you're a self-employed person that's particularly registered as a sole trader, that is your main avenue, hopefully, for support. There are, as we've said, there's a lot of people excluded from that scheme, but there are other avenues to help you through this period. Now, the job retention scheme, the government furloughing scheme, as it's known, which is a bit of an Americanism, is extended to October. And actually, it is available to limited company directors as long as you pay yourself something through PAYE. Not every limited company director will, but a lot of you will, and to varying degrees. So if you haven't yet, well, I mean, you'd have to have already furloughed yourself. And I know a lot of our members have, and a lot of people I've spoken to who are limited company directors in all walks of life have done that in order just to keep a little bit of, give themselves a little bit of money going forward. However, from I think this month, you have to actually contribute to the NI payment, which is more of an issue if you're an employee and an employer of people, because of course you could be a limited company director and have an employee, so that's something to consider too. Other than that, there's a bounce back loan, which is introduced by the government. It's 100% guaranteed, and it's particularly aimed at small businesses and the self-employed. And it follows a much bigger business interruptions loan, which was outlined way back in March. There's no interest for the first 12 months. Of course, there is some reluctance to take on extra debt if you have a bit of a problem with cash flow, as many people will at the moment. But these bounce back loans are much smaller, and the opportunity to not pay any interest back the first year could help smooth you through the worst of the COVID crisis, hopefully. There are also a vast range of grants available if you work in particular industries. Now, I know that these are I know the creative industry representative body, so for instance the BFI, the British Film Institute, they have a scheme. A lot of them are in the more creative kind of the arts directors, aimed at people that work in TV and film and theatre and things. However, there are other grants available, and actually local authorities have been given some money from the government. So the best people probably to contact for those are your local Chamber of Commerce. Some councils I know are much better advertising the grants they do have than others, and actually like weird things like Middlesbrough and Coventry were really quick out the door. In London, I think a couple of local councils have been really good at getting information out there through the local press, and trying to support people as much as possible. Of course, there has also been a slight change to welfare support, which is now quicker and easier to apply for, and I'll come to that in a bit more detail in a second. There's also a specific helpline, which the number for is at the end of this presentation, which again it was set up quite early on. I think it was announced in March and came out in April. And it's specifically aimed at very small business owners and the self-employed, limited company directors, of course. And that will help you do all kinds of things, but it provides advice. But also, I know a lot of people have been able to defer their VAT payment for July to next January, and perhaps there might be some wiggle room beyond that. Maybe the government will look at that again if that has to continue, perhaps. But that's a really useful resource. And there is other support available. Universal credit is something which you might want to look at, particularly in the short term. However, there are some problems in applying. One is that it does take 5 weeks to come through, and the government were heavily criticised for not trying to reduce that, but the minister got up in Parliament and said it's not going to happen. So it does take 5 weeks to come into effect. There's also some limitations on the amount of money you can claim if you have savings above 6k, and if in fact you have 16k saved up, which that could be the money you were going to spend on your tax payments, that could affect you. So you might want to look at whether or not you've got a business account specifically and these sorts of things. It might be easier to navigate if that's the case. But the standard allowance has increased, although it's not tons of money. It might be helpful, and it's also a hell of a lot easier to apply for. One thing we've been calling for a removal generally for universal credit for ages is something called the minimum income floor. The government have removed that. That basically stipulates that they'll sort of match a self-employed income to an equivalent employee income and then judge how much you'll get. And actually, because of the variability of people's incomes, when you are self-employed or a freelancer, they can go up and down quite easily. That means a lot of people were locked out of the system very unfairly. That has luckily been removed and makes it a lot easier to apply for. There is also employment and support allowance, which can be paid for from the first day of sickness, which has changed from the third day. Again, £73 a week isn't tons of money, but in certain circumstances, if you have found yourself excluded from other support mechanisms, a combination of these might be able to help you out in, if you have been particularly adversely affected. And And of course, we have a lot of advice out there as well, Andy.
Yes, we do. Sorry, I'm just making notes of all the questions. Yeah, so yeah, go to our COVID hub. There's lots of information on there, so it's worth checking that out. I have a couple of questions actually, some relevant to what you were just talking about, Ryan. One of them is from is about the bounce back loans, and the question was, the repayments on that is due to start in June next year, and do we think that that could be delayed if there is a second wave? And that's from Alex. I think that could be, that's the sort of thing that I think the government, excuse me, would look at as a policy response. If there's a big second wave, I think they may well start looking at things like that. There has been some talk, not from the government, I hasten to add, there's been no official, I've never heard anyone official even mentioning this, but some people have wondered aloud whether those bounce back loans might be, written off because people may be struggling so much to pay them back, and it might be more helpful for business if they just were allowed to keep them. Now, no one in the government has ever said that, so I don't want to get anyone's hopes up that may have taken out a bounce back loan and think that might be the case. But that is what some people have thought about. I think that if the economy is not in good shape next June, and we're still in the grips of this pandemic, and indeed we've seen a second and a third wave, I think that could well be the type of thing that ministers would consider.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a fairly easy measure to introduce. There is a little bit of a concern about the amount of interest that might have to be paid as well, of course, and the government could perhaps look at that as well. These measures aren't hard because they're 100% backed by the government. They're quite easy to sort of continue because the banks won't put up a fight, really, because the government can say, well, look, you're going to get your money regardless. There are a couple of questions about universal credit, about the threshold, Andy. So Greg has said if the threshold is, I think it might be for the furlough. Can you explain how limited company directors can claim while furloughed if the threshold is £409 per month and you're a limited company director paying more than that?
I'm just going to try and find that question. So, I mean, it sounds to me like we're talking here about if someone is paying themselves a salary which is relatively small compared to their total income, most of which is made up of dividends. Some directors will pay themselves a relatively small salary, perhaps around £8,000 a year, which keeps them under some NI thresholds where they have to start paying national insurance. And that sounds like the kind of figure that we're talking about per month potentially. I can find the question now. So if the threshold is that, and you are a limited company director paying yourself the 533, then you're above the threshold. I'm afraid I don't quite understand. I don't think I quite understand, but I'll have to take that question away, Greg, and try and think about that. Perhaps you could email us at policy queries, and we can just set that question out a bit more clearly, and I'll try to wrestle with that one. Some other questions that we've had in. Robin made a point about the adversely affected element of the SAYS scheme and how adverse does adverse have to be. That is the question. It is open to interpretation to say I have been adversely impacted by the coronavirus, and this is exactly the problem. Greg, who asked that previous question that I was hopelessly unable to answer, and apologies, but I will try to come back to that, Greg, has also made a couple of other points about Paul Scully, who I mentioned earlier, is the small business minister who came onto this webinar. And he was initially, as Greg points out, very supportive of company directors. He went on to someone else's webinar, actually, before we had him on. And he said on there, he said, look, I'm interested in ways that we can help company directors. So I want to hear evidence. Please send in your ideas. So, of course, IPSE immediately wrote to him and said, we've got an idea of how you can help them. He came onto our webinar as well, where we were able to discuss that with him in a bit more detail. I think that he genuinely wanted to do something, and the Treasury, he's in the business department, the Treasury have decided that they're not going to do something. And at that stage, he's had to become conspicuous by his absence, as you point out, Greg, in your question. So thanks for that. And you also mentioned that there's this talk of risk of fraud or risk where it comes to company directors of overpaying people because they've got dividends from elsewhere. And this is a big concern of the government. But what about things like schemes like the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which is now up and running? You know, where's the proof that someone's actually turned up to eat there? It's potentially very open to fraud or false claims from restaurants who are saying, well, we're owed this much from the scheme, we've given these discounts. I mean, presumably they have to evidence it in some way, but I do take your point that I can imagine it wouldn't be too difficult to make up a few fraudulent documents to overclaim there. So, I mean, that has had a lot of criticism, that though I have to say, I did notice last night as I was cycling past the restaurant near me, that it was absolutely rammed. I've never seen it much more rammed than that restaurant usually is. So it seems to be, if the intention is to get people into restaurants and spending some money, it does seem to be working.
I think
go on,
yeah,
go on, Mike.
I think that's been very, very popular. I mean, a lot of people I know, you know, I'm sort of in my late 20s, and there's a lot of people my age who are specifically saying, oh, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. But the reports coming back are actually people saying, well, my Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday restaurant bookings are full, but no one wants to come on Saturday and Sunday now. So there's, and you know, and actually the other thing that was announced has kind of gone under the radar, that I know a couple of limited company directors and someone that runs a pub I know, and a couple of others who run small businesses, is this furlough reward grant. I can't remember what it was called, but it comes out in January, and it's the money that you get paid if you keep someone on the payroll if they've been furloughed. And that's come into a lot of criticism that's gone under the radar a little bit, because a lot of people are saying, well, it's great that you're going to give me £1,000 in January, but I can't afford to pay them up until then now anyway, so there's no chance of me getting the grant. So you know, it's not all rosy. A lot of these schemes, there are some serious problems with them, the government have outlined. A lot of it's quite impressive and interesting and, you know, unprecedented, but there are complications, and as Greg's right to point out, there are chances for fraud, and you wonder how much has been thought through with some of these things.
Yeah, I think that the government they are being quite radical with a lot of this stuff. They are coming up with brand new things that have never been tested before, and they're seeing what works and if it works, and they're desperately trying to help, but it may not always be the best solution. What upsets us at IPSE, and no doubt many IPSE members, is that when it comes to company directors, they don't seem to want to be too radical. That's where they're saying, well, computer says no. Whereas, you know, on everything else, it's kind of sky's the limit. We can dream up any scheme we want to help people, and that's been one of the sort of the kicks in the teeth. Alongside them, of course, pushing ahead with the IR35 changes in the private sector, on which we've had a couple of questions. John asked, what was the purpose of the House of Lords 67-page report into the shortcomings of IR35? The government, it seems, simply ignored it and will push on with the IR35 private sector rollout in April 2020. And John asked a subsequent question, is that date now set in stone? Is this definitely coming in April 21, or could there be another delay in the event of a second or third spike? So where we are with IR35 is that the government's finance bill has received royal assent, which means it is now passed. There is no further parliamentary scrutiny that can take place of that legislation, and contained within the finance bill are the clauses which would change the way that IR35 works in the private sector. There was a debate in Parliament, and there was some amendments tabled, one of which was David Davis's amendment, which would have delayed the rollout by a further 2 years, which we rallied round, and many IPSE members, perhaps some of you on this webinar, raised this with your own MPs and asked them to support that amendment. We got all the opposition parties to support it, which was good. We weren't sure what the Labour Party were going to do. They went quiet on us, but in the end they did support it, along with the SNP and the Lib Dems, who also had their own amendments tabled on this. And about 11, I think it was 11 Conservative rebels supported it too. But with such a big majority, we needed 40 odd rebels from the Conservative side to actually get that amendment through. And unfortunately, we didn't get that. And rumours abound that the Prime Minister himself intervened and went into MPs' offices and said, I hear that you're thinking of supporting this amendment, please don't. In fact, that was, I think was it Crispin Blunt or Christopher Chope? There was an MP. Yeah. I don't want to get it wrong. There's an MP who published, who wrote to their constituents to explain why they hadn't supported the amendment, and explained that was the case, that the Prime Minister personally intervened, and that constituent put that up on Twitter so everyone could see that letter. So it just goes to show you this went right to the very top, and this government is determined to push ahead with this IR35 change. Does that mean it's absolutely over? It's never over till the fat lady sings. And I could well see a last-minute reprieve because of COVID or something else, and IPSE will continue to lobby on this. I can assure you of that. We have not given up. We're going to continue to make the case. But the reality is that if nothing changes, those rules will be coming in April 21, and it would really take, you know, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to say we're going to pull that now. We've changed our minds. We're scrapping it. It would take that to change it now. It would be somewhat difficult to change it. They'd have to introduce legislation to do it. They could do it, and it's possible, and we will be pushing for them to do it. But I have to say, we do also need to start preparing our members for what will happen if and when this does come in, and how they can best prepare themselves for that. And we are going to be doing lots of work around that too over the coming months. Right, that was I've got somewhat sidetracked on the IR35 thing there, but anyway, now yeah, there was an interesting question I saw a minute ago, and I think it was from Bhavani, who said, "What's the future for contractors? Companies are cutting their budgets for freelancers, and there's going to be lots of sort of out of work freelancers who are working in the creative sectors and the hospitality sectors, which famously have been so badly hit by this pandemic. The market's going to be completely saturated. You know, is there any point in continuing?" There's been a little bit of talk around this, and there may well be an article on the BBC website, and possibly something on, they might make a little video for it too, about the self-employed numbers and the impact of the coronavirus on the self-employed. We've been feeding into that. And the question everyone's asking is, ordinarily, well, not ordinarily, in the 2008 financial crash, we saw a surge in the numbers of self-employed people after that. Directly after the crash, there was a big rise in self-employment. In fact, self-employment had been rising steadily since about 2000. So it's been 20 years, it's just been on the up. And then the crash, it really accelerated, and then it continued to go up after that as well. So the question is, are we going to see another such surge after this, as we emerge from this economic slump? I think that it is quite possible that we will. I think that many businesses will be looking to engage freelancers because they don't have to employ the person, they can be more flexible with it, it will help them to innovate and to grow, and for all the good reasons that we've been saying at IPSE for such a long time, that the self-employed play a vital role in the economy of the UK. However, there are some countervailing pressures against that. One of them is the aforementioned IR35, which is a huge barrier being put in place by the government. Any company that now wants to hire a contractor has to consider the IR35 rules, probably engage them via some umbrella company. The contractor doesn't want to do that. It really gets in the way of doing that. And indeed, once they do that, are they really a contractor? Because if you're working by an umbrella, technically you're often employed by that umbrella. So it gets very, very complicated to say that that's still a self-employed person there, really. And the second countervailing factor is that we've already seen, as Ryan's been through, a big drop in the numbers of self-employed people right now. Now, if that continues and we see self-employed numbers driven down because there's no work for them to do, and then compounded by the IR35 change, it may take some time for that population to grow back up again. And as for the idea that there's going to be lots of people with no work to do, and therefore the market will be saturated with sort of out of work freelancers, well, I think some sectors are going to be hit worse than others with that one. As Bhavani, you mentioned in your question, you know, looking in the creative sectors, we know we've got friends at the Creative Industries Federation with whom we did a petition before the initial SAY scheme was launched. I think that you're right. I think that in that sector, it's going to be really, really difficult to be a freelancer. If you're a designer, if you're a musician, I think that times are going to be tough for some time, because that level of work
been sustaining that whole population for some time may not be back for quite a long time. So I do fear for certain sectors. I think in other sectors, things are going to be okay. I mean, Ryan mentioned online retail has been doing very well. And if you look at Amazon, they've done, their profits are up. Amazon's profits are up during COVID. That's reassuring for everyone, isn't it? It's a good news story.
I think
a bit more money for Jeff Bezos. That's what the world needs. But just to pick up on that point as well, there was a story actually in the Times. I'm just going to give myself a bit of shameless self-promotion here. Front page of the Times today. This story about Amazon. What they've done is they've tried to pass off the cost of the new digital services tax, which the government has levied on these big global corporates like Amazon, to say that you're not paying enough tax in this country, so we've created this new tax, which means that when you make a sale in the UK, you're going to pay some tax on it directly to the government. And Amazon have said, well, we're going to palm that off by upping our fees to all our sellers, people who use our platform to sell through, many of whom would consider themselves to be self-employed. You know, so that's an example there of more impact on the self-employed right at the very worst time. And at the time where Amazon could be helping these people, they're actually sort of making it worse for them. And by the way, we're quoted in that story as well, front page of the Times, quite nice for IPSE. And what we're saying is, you know, the self-employed should not become collateral damage in a battle between the UK government and Amazon. You know, some protection should be given to them, and Amazon, in fact, should be really considering their own position on this. You know, these self-employed sellers have already paid tax in the UK. They are paying tax in the UK. They shouldn't be hit with this cost so that they can relieve the tax that Amazon now might have to pay in the UK as well. I've got sidetracked there. I can't remember what we were talking about before, but good question from Bhavani.
But well, I think on Bhavani's question as well, you know, so actually I've done quite a lot of research on this recently. We've got a paper coming out in the next couple of months that looks at a lot of the IPSE research into the self-employed sector over the last 7 years of the confidence index that we do. And ultimately, people have gone into self-employment in higher skilled jobs in the majority, in freelancing. They're not going into lower paid jobs, and most people are doing it out of choice because they see flexibility and they get some kind of self-actualization from becoming self-employed because of control over you know what they work on. And you know, there is a problem probably already. I mean, if you look at employment, you know, as I said, vacancies have gone down, and there's anecdotal evidence of 300 people going for jobs, you know, for one particular job. And if you extrapolate that to the self-employed, it's probably quite similar. However, eventually, the furlough schemes and things, if the government are going to have to try and stimulate the economy, they're going to have to employ people. And if the government are going to try and pursue this levelling up agenda or green people's homes and economies and things, you're going to need people that are, you know, self-employed and small businesses to do a lot of that work. You know, contractors, one of the biggest areas for contractors and freelancers is in the construction sector, providing both expertise but also, you know, manual skills. And it'll be the same. I think one thing to bear in mind though is that all those job losses for employees at places like Pret and WX Smith, there's so many self-employed people in the country now that every time you see a job loss somewhere in a traditional firm, somewhere there's a contractor, you know, working for that firm. Almost certainly, I think for something like WX Smith, somewhere in the back end, someone's a contractor, so there will be someone affected. However, this way of working and what the government wants to do presents opportunities for people, and that won't change regardless of the economic situation, I think. So eventually things will recover is my hunch.
Just a couple of quick ones that I can answer. I just saw one from David. If someone claims under the SAY scheme, could they be entitled to a bounce back loan? Yes, you can. It won't impact your entitlement to a bounce back loan if you've had a payment from the SAY scheme. And also just so we're clear, the SAY scheme, if you get the SAY scheme, it doesn't stop you getting universal credit payment either, but it will impact how much you get from that. So if you're on universal credit, that doesn't impact how much you get from SAYS, because SAYS is based on historical stuff. But if you get a payment from SAYS, that will impact how much you get from universal credit. I hope that helps. And I now do understand Greg's question, because he's very helpfully come back with a more full explanation. It's all about the interaction of being a furloughed company director and receiving a payment from that, and then making a claim for universal credit as well. And and he's given some specific amounts that he's claiming. And Greg, I will come back to you on that one. I will email you and try to give you a full answer to that question when I've had a bit more time to digest the figures that you're talking about within there. Give me a couple of days though, because I've got loads on, but I promise you I will come back to you on that one. There was one other question that I wanted to come to, actually, that was from Francis. Brexit, says Francis, is by no means done, because I think we quickly mentioned it earlier on and said, like, you know, we thought that was tough, and now this is so much worse. And this is going to have a big impact on many businesses. You're absolutely right, Francis. And we've actually been wondering whether at some stage in the autumn we will do a webinar on Brexit to remind us all where we are with this process, what the impacts are going to be, what does it mean for those self-employed people that want to work within the EU and vice versa, and imports and exports and tariffs and all the rest of it that you referred to within your
intellectual property.
We haven't forgotten about Brexit, but it has. You're absolutely right. It's been the agenda. Whereas in 2019 you couldn't move for Brexit, it was all Brexit all the time, and in 2020 it's all COVID all the time. And so yes, it would still be a big story, wouldn't it, if it wasn't for COVID completely swamping the whole media agenda. And we will come back and look at that and do a webinar on it. I also wanted to mention that we're going to have next week on the webinar, it's going to be a guest speaker, Alison Grade, who's the author of a book about how to be a freelancer. Lots of helpful tips in there, so do register for that one. And the point that Ryan made earlier on about recruitment firms and what they're saying about hiring, I did say we might do that this week, but we are definitely going to have one of our good friends from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation coming in to talk to us all about how the agencies are seeing the impact of COVID, and also to get their views on the IR35 change as well, because they've lobbied pretty strongly against it as well. So just to hear what the agencies are saying around all that. So look out for that one in the coming weeks. I think we better leave it there, Ryan, unless there was anything burning that you saw in the questions that we had to explore.
No, but Wade has pointed something out. We said, will you share info on being company direct on furlough in universal credit? Now we do have an FAQ page on our website, Wade, and also, before we forget, these slides will be sent to you with the links on it, all the rest of it. And on our COVID hub, there's an FAQ page, and there should be some information on there, but maybe, I don't know if it spells it out, because like maybe we need to update it a little bit, Andy, and sort of point out to people exactly how things interact. Yeah,
we do have guidance on how to make use of the job retention scheme if you are a company director, and you can do that, and on universal credit as well. So that is all on there. Interestingly though, Wade's question somewhat refers to Greg's question, which is all about the interaction of those two and what you can claim from one if you're getting the other. And I'm just going to get back to Greg specifically on that, but perhaps we can do something else on that more. We can answer that in a subsequent webinar, or even a blog post or something. So we'll do.
Yeah, wise.
Right, well, thank you very much, everyone. We've gone over time now. Thanks for joining us this afternoon and for all your questions. It's really fun. Everyone's so good at sending in their questions, and we really do enjoy getting into those questions. It helps us to understand what the things that we're not talking about that we should be talking about. It helps us to compile future webinars. Please do fill out the feedback form as well, and we've had great ideas on those, on what we could do other webinars on. We are going to be diversifying. We've done a lot on COVID and a lot on IR35, and we're going to carry on covering those topics, but we're also going to think about some other topics that we could do as well, especially moving into the autumn. So yeah, thanks very much, and goodbye.